Well, here we are on a pleasant midday. Look, I want to talk about a subject which a lot of people have conflicting views about, and that's parliamentary elections and whether they make a difference. Now, historically, as far as human history is concerned, since the Industrial Revolution, a representative democracy where you elect a representative to 3 to 4 years to make a decision for you over the next 3 to 4 years has become entrenched in many sovereign nation states. It's a little bit different to the situation 2 centuries ago and to the situation in some sovereign nation states where one person or a small clique make all the important decisions to determine the outcome in that particular society. Now, the struggles which occurred during the 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th centuries were struggles to wrest power for that 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, whether it's a hereditary ownership or ownership through exploiting other people's labour. So what we saw, especially after World War II, when so many people died in the battle against fascism, that people demanded a little bit more as far as their lives were concerned. They were no longer willing to leave it to God, King and country. And through agitation, what happened during that period is that reforms were created, as they were created in this country, significant reforms, where people formed political parties or pressured established political parties to put reforms on the agenda. Now, this came to a head in Australia after World War II with the introduction of a Commonwealth Social Security system, and it came to a head with the election of the Whitlam Labor government in 1972, where a huge number of reforms were pushed through Parliament, including one which continues today, which is Medicare, which is a universal health insurance scheme. So, does participation make a difference? Whilst participation in terms of just casting a ballot doesn't make that much of a difference, because you've got this constant tension between that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the rest of society. This tension. And what we've seen over the last 40 years during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution which has swept across Australia, what we have seen is more and more and more reforms which are achieved through struggle and through the ballot box being swept away. So we now have a situation where that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication continues to flourish at the expense of the majority of the population. The whole purpose of the parliamentary system was to create a society where there was the greatest good for the greatest number. That was its underlying aim. Now, those of you who listen to traditional media, legacy media, or go on the World Wide Web, will note that we seem to be talking about the same problems over and over again. And to a significant degree, these problems are related to the fact that most of our resources are not in the hands of the people, but in the hands of a small group of people which have been given that privilege by elected parliaments. So people become disillusioned and they say, well, what's the point? What's the point? Well, the thing is, change comes from upward pressure. That's where change comes from. That's why we form public interest before corporate interests. It comes from upward pressure. It comes from pressure for change. Having something appear on social media or the World Wide Web or the legacy media, having election campaigns managed in such a way does not promote change. What it forces is political parties concerned about the parliamentary puppet masters narrowing their gaze in terms of their promises, in terms of their agenda, to such a narrow focus that change becomes impossible. And this has occurred because the debate which occurs in society is a debate about working up the right channels. It's not a debate about direct action, it's not a debate about protests, because ultimately it's protests which can dramatically shift a political agenda, even during a parliamentary election. Allowing the legacy media and the virtual media to dominate that process by focusing on a few individuals, leaders of political parties, during that period destroys any hope of significant change. So the time for protest, with federal election 6-7 months away, is now. Because we need to build up the momentum for a change in policy. Currently, our political representatives are more frightened of the small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication because of their powerful role in shaping debate, and they are frightened of the people they represent. Now, our parliamentary system is a particularly primitive one. It's based on the concept that you elect somebody for 3 to 4 years and you give them a signed blank cheque. Those of you who remember what cheques are. You give them carte blanche to do what they like during that period. And the dilemma is you can do nothing apart from protest. Now, small numbers of people protesting does have an impact. It doesn't have an impact in terms of changing laws, but it does have an impact in broadening the debate about what is important or what should be important. Because if we think that parliamentary democracy is about creating the greatest good for the greatest number, the type of parliamentary democracy we have today is not doing that, because it can be usurped by people with power and wealth. And that's the dilemma we face. The first dilemma we face is that most of the debate that occurs in this country today about what we should do is focused on finding scapegoats for the situation we find ourselves in. We're particularly good at finding scapegoats since federation. There's always a scapegoat. You can always find a scapegoat. I mean, initially it was the Irish Catholics. Now, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have always been good scapegoats. Then you had migrants, refugees, you name it. People with a different religious background, who talk a different language, different gender, different sexual orientation. And while we continue to think that finding scapegoats and removing scapegoats in one way or another, that our problems will resolve, they will not resolve. Fighting amongst ourselves on the basis of identity is a total waste of time, because it reinforces the power of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange, communication. Just in case you think I'm talking garbage, one little fact. 40 to 50 years ago, before the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation revolution, if you had a disposable income and you invested in something and that business was successful, 1/3 of the profits made by that business would come to you as an investor. 2/3 would go to the people who created that profit. Today, less than 4 decades later, it's the reverse. 2/3 of any profit goes to the people who invest, and 1/3 goes to the people who create that profit through their labour. So that's the fundamental difference, and that has occurred because Parliament, to a significant degree, parliamentary power has been usurped by that group who continue to limit reform opportunities through the parliamentary process. It's one thing about having a complete revolution. It's another thing placing increasing pressure on representatives to look at different ways of doing things. Now, we are told that in the 21st century, the only way forward is through a private investment, through private profit philosophy, ideology, whatever you like to call it. We have political parties who think that the only way forward is through the private sector. Now, we have seen what happens when government steps aside and allows the private sector to do what it likes. To a significant degree, much of the pain that most people are experiencing because the people experiencing the greatest economic difficulty today is a consequence of the political and economic system we have currently. For example, interest rate goes up, corporate profitability goes up. Corporations have not suffered because of an increase in interest rates. Then we have the ludicrous situation of, ordinary people being asked to carry the can for an economic system which finds itself in this situation. Then we have the situation with such draconian laws against trade unions in this country that what we see is that striking has become illegal outside of an enterprise bargaining agreement period, and what we see is that real wages have not kept up with inflation. So when inflation started to go upwards, it was the fact that real wages hadn't kept up with inflation that forced so many people into this difficult situation. So the reality is that you can have reforms through the parliamentary system. You can't have major change, but you can have reforms which improve people's situation, not just their personal situation, but their economic situation. And there are differences between major political parties. Now, the Whitlam Labor government was able to put through more reforms in 4 years than have occurred in the last 50 years for one very good reason. Because the population in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a much more radical one which wanted change. And demonstrations and protests were a common feature, and strikes, occupations were a common feature of that period. This drove the Labor Party to take on a reform agenda. Without that pressure from below, there would be no reform agenda. Today, there is no reform agenda. And there is no reform agenda because politics is played outside of the day-to-day lives of every people. There is no reform agenda because there is no pressure for change, because people are too busy fighting against the other, trying to find scapegoats for their current situation. Our current situation is directly related to the fact that a shrinking number of people own more and more of this country's resources and land, not just at the expense of this country's First Nations people, but at the expense of everybody else in this country who is not part and parcel of that 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Obviously, there is a small section of the population, about 8 to 9%, which benefit those people with disposable income, who can then use that disposable income to invest and use this country's investment-friendly laws to minimise their taxation. But the fact is, while we have no control over our resources, while we give away our resources at a peppercorn rent to corporations whose major responsibility is to create ever-increasing profits for their major shareholders, we will find ourselves in a ludicrous situation where the second biggest gas exporter on the planet needs to import gas next year to keep industry alive on the east coast of Australia. What a ridiculous situation. And this is what highlights what happens when we privatise our essential services, our infrastructure, and we allow the corporate sector to run life in this country. Another interesting fact, 10 years ago, 40% of people were involved in small business. Today it's almost less, it's about around 30%. For one very good reason, because corporations have been allowed to dominate spheres that small business has been involved in the past and actually put them out of business. No wonder 90% of Australian businesses go out of, fail within 5 years of being established. So we have major issues, but parliamentary change can come. Reforms like Medicare, reforms like legal aid, reforms like a social security system, reforms in terms of education, healthcare, aged care, they can all come. But the type of reforms which will be presented to you at this election will be reforms which are based on a private investment for private profit mantra. There are political organisations and individuals which will sing a different message, but that message will be lost. It will be lost because there is no pressure from us. That's right, there is no pressure to change the discourse, change the debate, change what we are talking about. Now, public interest before corporate interest was established to try, and the key word is to try, to change that trajectory as far as the debate and about what is possible and what is needed. That's what it was about. But in order for us to be able to do that, we need your support. I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about joining. Join public interest before corporate interest. You can do that very easily by going to the website pibci.net, and if you're not, you can't do that, we can always send you an application form. So think about it. You want more of the same, where even Parliament cannot deliver the necessary reforms to ensure the 70 to 80% of Australians who find themselves in an increasing difficult situation can prosper? Or do you want to live in this society where more and more power and wealth continues to gravitate in the hands of a shrinking minority.